I'm extremely honoured to introduce our keynote speaker, George Deleon. George will be known to all of you as our guiding light on TC practice. George has written extensively on the principles of TC and recovery-oriented systems. We have been privileged that he has flown in all the way from New York for this conference. We chatted earlier, and he told me that he wants a session that's both unorthodox and stimulates discussion. He is joined by Karen Biggs, the CEO of Phoenix. So now, folks, over to you.
I didn't know you wanted an orthodox.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, okay. So, George, thank you for coming. I know you're very much looking forward to this session, and we all are too, and particularly our residents. I don't know if you can see, but they're all snuck in at the back as well. So, just to give everybody the heads up, we are hoping that we will have some questions around the theme of integrity, fidelity, and the methodology of the TC.
Right.
So we will have, we do want this session to be a conversation within the room, so please do be thinking of your questions around those themes. But before we get into that, you've got some thoughts that you want to start us off with.
Yeah, well, good morning, family.
Good morning, George.
Good morning, family.
Good morning, George.
All right. Somebody has to wake me up on this. My interest, of course, in coming here is just, again, to be among you, and this, to me, is the nourishment that I need to carry on. To move this, to make this a worthwhile discussion, if you will allow my arrogance on this, I want to just lay out a series of bullet points which will establish at least a common, hopefully, a common knowledge base for any discussion we're talking about. Even in all of my work and speeches and conferencing, I always discover I never can rely on the audience having an understanding of some of the basics of the whole topic. So I try to at least nail down, you know, does everybody agree on what we're talking about? Then we can get into the discussion about what are the questions and challenges that we have. So I want to review historically, and this will be a little bit formal because I'm going to try to see what I wrote. I'm not sure I will be able to, but look, so it's all historical. So here's the historical, what I call the bullet points of history of the therapeutic community. Not to tell a story, but just to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of a knowledge base. One is that the whole approach, therapeutic communities for addictions in North America, not therapeutic communities in England, which preceded that. In 1948, there were therapeutic communities, you know, the Maxwell Jones therapeutic communities, and quite remarkable settings in their own right. What we're talking about, our history is that therapeutic communities for addiction as the primary disorder is addiction. That was the problem in the United States. And the problem in England, the primary disorder was personality disorder, just to clarify that distinction for you. And that's one of the reasons democratic TCs went in one direction and addiction TCs went in quite another. But they are related, and there are many shared characteristics, and it's not a discussion for today, but it's only to make that point that there are shared characteristics despite a differential historical origin. So in the addiction TC, which is the work that we do, we had a raging epidemic around 1960. Synanon, that great, remarkable institution that you've heard a great deal about, was already in motion in terms of what it was doing. And what the point I want to make about that is that Synanon and pretty much the first generation of TCs that followed that was developed, the whole approach basically was developed by the participants. So while that may sound obvious in terms of mutual self-help, think about that in terms of a healthcare approach, if you like, or something that might have been developed among academics, which it wasn't. It wasn't developed in universities. It wasn't developed in hospitals. It was developed by the participants themselves who got no help from society at all, couldn't manage them. And in terms of ancient history, that has always been true. That is, there's been large groups of people that have been disaffiliated from the society. They went off and made their own camps. They were communes. They ultimately had various fates of disappearing because they couldn't get into the mainstream, even though they were trying to treat something that society wouldn't treat for them. Well, we had that fate, possibly, except that those first generation, including Synanon and the first generation of TCs, actually wanted to get into the mainstream. And that is, they formed basically all of the basic elements of the TC. It doesn't mean it was perfect. It doesn't mean that there were important changes that needed, and as I mentioned yesterday, that there weren't warts and all on that occurred. But the basic approach was not developed by professionals, was not developed by academics, not doctors or anything like that, or psychologists. It was the participants themselves. But in response to that heroin epidemic, this is the analog for today. We have overdose deaths and so on. In the crisis of the times, the people developed something for themselves. A. B, that those first TCs, first year of TCs, the profile of the clients that were going into those treatments were primarily substance abuse disorder. That was the presenting disorder. That is, the reason why people even considered coming into a TC is that they had a drug problem, is what they would say. Even though we now, of course, we knew then and we know now, of course, you had more than a drug problem, and the TCs, including, as Synanon taught us, the problem is you, it's not the drug. And so the issues of the whole person disorder was already established front line. And the profile of the client was serious in terms of their drug abuse, in terms of their antisocial behavior in many cases, and other psychological problems that look like personality disorder. The second bullet is that, or the third bullet, is that when those programs were launched, myself and other people at the time recognized that it was going to be necessary to do research. We'll get nowhere in terms of moving into the mainstream unless we do research, because nobody's going to listen to us without any numbers. So that was the kind of guiding premise of we had to do research. And Phoenix House in New York, of course, was one of the leading places to do that, and it's where I lived for 20 years in terms of doing my work, the original work then. And when we did those studies, initially we did some preliminary studies, and then I managed to get a grant from National Institute on Drug Abuse to do a large-scale outcome study, which I did, and you can read about all that. But the headline, as you know, of those early studies was, if you really followed the clients in treatment over time, and those treatments in those days were at least 24 months as planned durations of treatment, which of course is absurd today, right? But if you followed clients who left treatment, of course the issue was most of the people couldn't tolerate that treatment, or they only tolerated portions of it and then left. So the dropout rates were high. And so the issues was, if we were going to learn anything about the effectiveness of therapeutic communities, we're not only going to have to look at graduates, which everybody takes a bow for, but we're going to have to look at the 3/4 essentially, or 60% of the people who don't finish that treatment. So that was new about the research that we did then, and in terms of that fact, we reported results showing the direct relationship between how long you stayed in treatment and what you looked like 2, 5, and 7 years later after treatment, including that smaller subset of graduates who actually completed 18 to 24 months, the kind of gold standard clients, you understand, who completed that. Well, of course, they had the best success rates. No crime, no drugs. They're very rigorous outcome criteria, as a matter of fact. No crime, no drugs for all years out. So we didn't even tolerate one episode of a relapse and to call you absolute success. It was very rigorous, and it was very demanding. And in many ways it was wrong, but at least it had that rigor to it. So if you look at this point I'm now making, as I'm summarizing now in a brief paragraph, the other historical point of information that you need to have. Those early outcome studies were done on that kind of a client, and the graduates showed, of course, the best rates. 80% were called success, which means no drugs and no crime for at least some number of years. And also, in many cases, we added the issue of full employment and education to really show that there was a whole person change in this. But when we looked at the large number of clients who didn't finish, from 1 month in treatment all the way up, all the way up to the graduate numbers of 18 and 24 months, there was a direct relationship between how many people would be called successful and how many people essentially would be called less than successful. We didn't call them failures because that was not a good word, it was the wrong word. There was a direct kind of a dose-response curve, and I was telling Karen that at one point we had an opportunity to present this at Rockefeller University because I did want to convert that information to the academic society, medical society, in that language. I said, it looks like dose response. The higher the dose you get, the better the outcome you get. And the data were very clear. Now, you need to remember that because NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse in the United States, of course, was very impressed with that, even though Rockefeller University wasn't, my academic colleagues, you know what I mean, because it wasn't a randomized controlled trial. I was just lamenting to Karen about that history. But the fact that it was done on 700-800 people in follow-up, and then finally repeated in a number of individual programs in New York showing the same findings, and then Koyman here in Europe showed it again when he was using the same model here in the Netherlands. And very quickly, in a matter of less than a decade, we had a tremendous amount of research which showed the same findings. That if these were the clients you were treating, their presenting disorder was drug abuse. I keep repeating this. We're going to come back to the whole issue of methodology. It all has to do with who are you treating and what are they presenting. But if the presenting disorder is substance abuse, and there's a lot of associated issues that they have to deal with, and you implement a high fidelity TC, namely you've got all the elements of the model in place, and you all have the skills for the practice to be in place, then you'll generate the same findings. That's what we're finding. Now, that may be obvious to you. I don't think so. But if you appreciate this part of our discussion, that's early history. And now we're laboring for decades since early history about whether we can survive as an approach, whether we can deal with 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. So it's as if there's been a kind of dismissal of the early history. When the TCs then began to continue to adapt in order to stay in the mainstream, deal with other populations, begin accepting the idea that maybe addiction is part of the mental health system, which was always a divisive problem from day one. I'm sorry I'm going to drift for a bit on this. Allow me, because
I will do.
You got to allow an old man to get some of his stuff off, But it was this point, and that is that I remember, I'm a psychologist by training, so I remember a time when the early TCs, when I was in Phoenix House, and were moving in very dramatic directions, and the mental health field had a chronic disdain for this field. They didn't like the client, and they didn't even like the few professionals like myself who were working with that client. We were all stigmatic, in that time. So the issue was, the relationship between addiction and mental health was divisive. And this was the early struggle that Max Jones and myself had in terms of, if it's a mental health-oriented approach, it seems to be more acceptable. But he complained about being on the fringe also, in terms of what he was doing, because even within his version of the democratic TC, he was struggling with the issues of acceptance. That's something we had in common. We all felt a little excommunicated, from the. But I hope you'll allow that one a little bit. It comes up every so often. So look, the critical points historically hopefully to set up this discussion is the fact that it was an approach that the clients, the participants didn't actually know that they were developing an approach, but they were developing it on a daily basis in a trial and error way, and through straight oral tradition they were doing that spontaneously. So it was not a professional approach. It was dealing with rather severe people who had disordered lives, not simply a drug abuse. And in fact, that when you implemented this approach, such as it was, the research that we had, even though it was not controlled research, showed very, very impressive findings, to the extent that the National Institute on Drug Abuse, from that time on, from essentially around 1968, 69, right up until 1990, would run nationwide survey studies, observational studies, not controlled studies, which involved long-term residential treatment as a modality, you know what I mean, which was mainly TCs, and then looking at methadone and looking at outpatient treatment. So if you summarize all of that research in terms of what was done, thousands of people had gone through long-term residential treatment over a 15 or 18-year period of observation of these data, observational data, showing the same findings. The longer people stayed, the better they did. Graduates did best. Where you began to see variability and decline was clearly related to TCs that were beginning to move and drift away from some kind of fundamental approach that I kind of summarize in the term fidelity. That's when we ran into trouble. And that is the TCs were right in terms of, well, we felt they were very arrogant also, of course, but we can treat a lot of people. And in my own, we got to a point where NIDA was able to fund a Center for Therapeutic Community Research, which I directed. I had actually applied for it, and they agreed to do it. And we were able to then to show the applications of the therapeutic community to special population, which included all mental health issues, adolescent issues, mothers with kids, prison TCs, methadone treatment in terms of introducing a TC for methadone clients, showing the application of the whole model. And the key, of course, is to now recognize as we moved in those directions, if we essentially had a grip on what we were doing in terms of the approach itself, the issue of fidelity, if we knew that this is what was going to be critical, that there was clearly an approach that was a model that needed to be implemented in the right way, we could have survived a lot of those insults that occurred in our period of adaptation and modification. And then finally, the kind of knockout blow was, well, can you do this in 3 months? Can you produce these outcomes in 6 months? And TCs were, taking bows and saying, yeah, well, we'll take them, because the recognition, at least my analysis, is that, of course, organizations had developed, like Phoenix Futures and all around the world, and you wanted to survive as an organization. So you took on what you took on. But the price we've paid for that is essentially the loss of fidelity. And the gradually generations of staff who were beginning to show less and less understanding of what they were doing. It's not because they were ignorant or unmotivated people, but they essentially could not get a handle on what they were doing, and those who had gone through TCs and early staff were moving into states of depression because they were feeling of, we've lost something. Are you with me so far on this? This is the context for this discussion. You may not like it, but I like it. I need it, But, so look, let me just now summarize point 2, and then you may have some questions about all this. Hopefully this will stimulate the questions that you want. If you review, as I've tried to review in several recent papers, is, well, what has been really the contribution of the TC? What's been the positive issues, overall mainstreaming of this TC approach from an alternate approach developed by the clients themselves all the way into the full mainstream, which has staffs of professional staffs as well as recovered staff and all of the positive and negative issues that are associated with those. There have been really profound contributions in the 50-year arc of the TC on that. And one of them is that it was really, I have said this audaciously, the therapeutic community was probably the first recovery-oriented treatment for addiction. They didn't say that. We didn't even use the word recovery until the 1970s. And the reason I said that is that we were really interested, unlike the medical treatments, and this is not a criticism, it's not a harm reduction argument, we were really interested in the ideas. We saw our view of the whole approach, which is part of the second contribution, that we have a theory now. Our view of the whole approach was that, look, this disorder of substance abuse is bigger than the substance abuse. And that what the client really needed was something more than simply stop using. We can get clients to stop using in the first 3 days that they were in treatment. The problem is not whether they can stop. The real problem is whether they can stay stopped. And what else had to change in order for them to sustain a real change in their lives so they don't use. Well, we had the methodology for doing that. And it was time-related. That's the only reason we've got long-term treatments. Turns out we now know a lot about recovery, using that word, namely. And the TC goals of recovery, the definition of it, in case you don't have it, is that our intention is not abstinence. Our intention is lifestyle and identity change. That's the way I tried to summarize it in terms of what really we were working on with these clients and what was the outcome for them. And if we could see measures and evidence of lifestyle change and essentially identity change, the movement from some kind of addict identity and associated negative elements to that to some full change in terms of growth, maturation, and so on. We have a lot of words for it now that a lot of researchers use. Those were the real outcomes. If you get those outcomes, you're going to minimize relapse. So that was a very important contribution to TC, recovery-oriented. Methadone didn't say that. Outpatient treatments didn't know quite what they were doing, and they wouldn't promise that. But the TCs were arrogant, and we had data, and we showed these very powerful transformational effects. Yeah, listen, they transformed me as a conventional psychologist. I walked in with Mitch into the program 6 months after it was launched, and I'm seeing people who were, had terrible disordered lives outside, running around with shirts and ties and having pads that they're working on. They got appointments to do. They're busy. I said, what's going on here? To me, it looked from almost day one that the TC was a transformational approach, which has kept me going for a few decades. I'm not as old as you think, but so look, that's a benefit you have to see in 50 years. It's a recovery-oriented approach, well described, even though it's not well accepted necessarily. It's well described. There's a third benefit. In the TC history, it generated the fundamental elements for, at least in North America, the fundamental elements for developing a drug treatment system. Because up until then, we had a very limited capability in the 1960s of handling widespread drug use. And the fact that the TCs essentially could take on a lot of people, remember, this is not a one-on-one treatment, right? We can take on 50, 60, 100, 200. That was very dramatic in terms of what NIDA was interested in, National Institute on Drug Abuse, is that a lot of people can be treated if you're really treating them, if good things are happening to them. So this is a very critical point, that we not only helped form the drug treatment system as we know it now. It's true in the UK too. That's pretty much the same system. You got a medical approach, harm reduction approach, outpatients approach, but less and less really good residential approaches. But there's a real product that we generated, which was the first real labor force to deal with the problem. The TC graduates contributed heavily to the personnel in other modalities, not only TCs, but other modalities, to help in the problem of dealing with people who have substance abuse disorders. Even in the outpatient settings and the sober living settings, it was the first labor force. A lot of people don't recognize that. It's news to them to hear that. And they were all participants in TCs. They had recovered through TCs. It wasn't that they didn't generate a traditional professional labor force, but a paraprofessional labor force, or what I would call, essentially a recovery professional. And of course, that's made a great contribution later to its version today, which is recovery coaches and so on. So you've got to understand at least these contributions to that. And then I'll end with this. So what's been the issues? The issues have been, when you finally look at, okay, we see what the contributions are, so what's happened to us then? Well, it's now obvious. And what's happened is, as we moved into the mainstream, and as the mainstream, to make that marriage work between essentially mutual self-help, but larger than that, I have a resentment to calling the TC simply mutual self-help. It's a lot more than that. And medical and the mental health criteria, making those marriages work. And we showed, even in a whole period of research at the Center for Therapeutic Community Research, that we can treat mentally ill individuals. We can treat adolescents with it. We can talk about how those adaptations have to be done right and why they can be done right. But the issue that emerged from that was the more we kept trying to do with that, treat those special populations, the more adaptations we had to make, and it was the first experience of the drifting away from the methodology that we knew worked. And it was difficult, essentially, making that marriage work, although I do want to tell you, we can make that marriage work. It's not even a promise for the future. We did in some classical programs early on, about how to really work with serious mental ill. As a matter of fact, Stan Sachs and myself and had a whole other wing of the Center for Therapeutic Human Research that launched TCs for seriously mentally ill clients. There's a difference between the clients that we see who had substance abuse as their primary disorder and a lot of other personality issues. We could treat those in the regular TC. But we knew there were going to be limits if you're going to be dealing with schizophrenics and bipolar disorders and so on, and that you're going to have to make a modification. We're able to do that. We've got books showing how to do that and how you can retain the methodology for those clients, which is a lot of the questions that we hope we're going to get into here. And then the adolescents and how they can bring you to your knees and why you got to really work with them in very special ways. So the point is that as we moved in to deal with these special populations, not only from the clinical point of view, but because of the issues of their regulations and their philosophies, we gradually began, there's a longer story about why it eroded, but that's why it's eroded. And finally, of course, the killer on this was they didn't want to fund long-term treatment, long-term residential treatment, the very involvement that assures that you're going to get long-term positive outcomes. That's the context. If I didn't take too much of your time, that's the context for the discussion that I was hoping for. You have to tell me whether it's relevant, that this little story that I ran through these bullets, whether this helps in terms of where we go next. I'm prepared to talk, and I know Karen's prepared to talk on this. So I'll stop at the moment.
Thank you, George. So just as you were talking then, I was reflecting on the origins of the TC movement and how much that actually has impacted the response that we've had from academics and from healthcare professionals. How much do you think that the origins of the TC, that people in addiction themselves created this methodology, how much do you think that has led to, and we are still living, the consequences of the views and the lack of trust within academic and healthcare?
Well, if I understand the vector that you're talking about, did our people or our work, our labor force, how much of an influence that we had on that? Is that?
I'm thinking how much is the mistrust of the TC methodology that we get from healthcare and from academics, how much of that comes from the fact that people in addiction themselves created this methodology at the beginning?
Well, yeah, you can ask the question that way,
yeah.
I think. What?
Impossible question, possibly.
You can ask the question that way in terms of how much the view of the TC by the mental health people. Let me repeat something. There is an historical issue between addiction and mental health. So you can't ignore that when you say, well, what's been kind of pervasive through 50 years? That's been an underlying pervasive issue. That is the traditional professionals, traditional mental health, traditional education people, they had a view of addiction, which was fundamentally a pejorative view. Yeah. They looked untreatable. They were calling addicts sociopaths by definition, you know what I mean? And it's not that they were unsympathetic, it's that they believed that these people and this disorder really was not kind of a respectable mental health disorder. This was both a social deviance issue. It was an outcast issue. It was very serious.
Lifestyle choice.
In those points. So it moderated, certainly. My argument is that the TC transformed that perception. It didn't get rid of it, but it transformed it because we imposed ourselves on the whole mental health system. Think about that. We did, because that's the arrogance of the TC itself, and that's been one of its problems. But this is one of its benefits, and that is that it, in fact, imposed on the mental health system. We've showed these long-term outcomes. They try to kill it by saying we don't accept it because it's not a controlled trial, but we still survived that. NIDA continued to still fund it. They're still funding it to a certain degree. And in fact, we gradually wore down, and here's what happened. We wore down some of that negative misperception and stigma. And as more traditional professionals got into TC work and counseling work, It further wore down their antipathy to it, but it did not really improve on either side, either the addiction side or the mental health side, their ability to implement this kind of approach. That's our problem. That's what we want to discuss today, at least try to move to what's our next steps if we can understand a little bit of this version of the history. Does that help?
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. So over to questions. So what we're going to ask you to do is put your hand up. We've got Jordan and Leanne with mics. The lights are going to go up. So hands up for questions, and we'd like you to stand and name, organisation, and then question for George. And Rod's hand shot right up. He was the first one that I could see. So Leanne, we've got Rod down here.
George, as always, fascinating presentation. You can summarize 60 years of history better than anybody I know. In frustration with you, I've sometimes used the metaphor that we invented penicillin and we're back to using leeches. But it seems to me that the fundamental dilemma is, if we stick with the original intention of a therapeutic community, which is identity change, real transformation, then we have no choice but to do high fidelity therapeutic communities, because that's the only thing that produces it.
Right.
Unfortunately, the people who fund us for either symptom relief or maybe symptom removal, but they do not have any great interest in what we can do, what we are designed to do. And this poses a huge dilemma, because we end up kind of sneaking in TC elements under cover of night, so that not in defiance of the funders, but simply to because they're not interested in it, and they and many often pose obstacles to us really doing real TC work. And then that poses, as everybody who has or is a CEO or has been one, the fundamental dilemma, which is, how do we keep the car on the road? How do we continue to fund this and perhaps develop some TC elements? You and I have talked about this before, which is maybe what we end up with is a large organization that has a TC core, and then many other operations which are ancillary and which are not really truly TCs, but sort of keep the funding adequate enough for us to at least preserve a core element of therapeutic community work. Would you kind of
I'm
talk
happy
a little bit
to talk
about that?
That sounds like a plant, and it's not a plant. I mean, but actually, it relates to our conversation yesterday. You were already asking for solutions on this, So maybe, I'll respond to this, Arun, and then we'll. So look, I'll jump to this because maybe time will run out on us. So I believe there is a solution to the issue that I've been now just kind of reviewing historically, and that you're now stating. The TC is a unique social psychological approach. Participants didn't talk that way, but we can easily classify it that way, and nobody would argue with it. Some would add the issues of social learning in there, but it's clear that that's the approach. It has developed a unique method. This is my formulation of the TC, which has essentially governed what I wrote in the original Red Book, and I'm hoping that will hold, not only for my ego, which is always present, but the issue of really, is this a reasonable formulation of the TC that can transcend a lot of these questions? And I'm saying, yeah, look, it's a unique social psychological approach, a lot of data to show it, and we can describe it with great care. We brought it to a point where it could be studied, trained, and researched. We know how to do that. The name of that approach, incidentally, is not therapeutic community, because that's a generic phrase. There have been therapeutic communities for 2,000 years. We're locked into that because you had the word therapy in that, and our Greek colleagues explained that to us. and community. But therapeutic communities are settings where healing effects occur. There are a lot of communities that heal. The therapeutic community for addiction developed a particular unique approach, a methodology for that. I tried to reframe that or reformulate as the use of the community as method because NIDA asked me in some ways, tell us what this method is. I didn't want to start giving them testimony again, that residents will say, about how they changed their lives and what did that. That didn't make any sense to the NIDA fund. What's the method? I said, well, the method is the community. That community is the method. So you say, all right, what is that method? So I'd like you to hear something on this, but you're going to have to pause for a moment because it's going to sound strange to you. There's a kind of definition for it that I think it took a while to carve out, but I think is right. When a community is actually a method, not because we have a lot of communities for everything, right? Shared norms for communities everywhere. That method essentially is a community that essentially teaches, the word is teach, a community teaches the individual to use the community to change themselves. That's the modern North American TC for Addictions ideal community as method. You go into this program, and if someone wants to ask you, what do you do in this program? We, the community, incidentally, the word community means all of the relationships, both peers and staff, and all of the activities, which is the classical hierarchical model with all of the role activities of the clients. Why we need all those ingredients in there, because we're trying to create a life that they're going to live in there. So we're going to teach you to use all of the relationships and all of the activities that we've staged, the model, so to speak, to change yourself. We'll do that. We'll teach you to use us to change yourself. It's not simply mutual self-help. It includes mutual, that's obvious, it includes mutual self-help. But the new version that I've been trying to teach with a lot of frustration is the one that we're now talking about. There is a real methodology here. I can give you a definition of it. It's a pretty clear definition of it. And we know that it takes your imagination to follow it through, because you walk into this program, and what you should really be hearing is, we're here. We're going to teach you how to use us. So when we're telling you all the things that you're supposed to be doing, which means we're setting up your experience here where you're going to learn to do things, but you're going to learn them because you're using this whole community, all of the resources. And each of those, you're going to learn something about yourself, and it is you that will walk out of here in terms of benefiting. We'll teach you how to do that, how to use us. Now, once you get down past the definition, you can say, okay, we got a basis now for real training. And not only that, we add, and which is your point, to produce the outcomes that we want, the kind of outcomes that we're after, which is essentially identity and lifestyle change. That's not a 6-month program. Those are not the goals for 6-month programs. We know now that that's going to take time. And notice it gets closer and closer to an educational model. We're not talking about a treatment. If it takes more and more and you keep growing, I don't want to keep that in the treatment idiom. I want to keep that in the growth and the learning idiom. The individual is learning and changing how to live their lives. So you're right. We say this is the classical approach that emerged from the original inspirations. A development of community as a method. You have a definition of it. And it has very definite goals. And not only that, they're time correlated. Now that's the one we want to save. And your point was, and it's my point, the organizations that now exist, instead of essentially falling into a full depression around this, and going in essentially drifting off into something else, keep doing what you're doing. You have to survive. If you're doing this with this group and this with this group, and working in sober living and working in 3 months, keep doing what you're doing. For a while, I was saying, get out of that business, you understand, and come back home. But now I'm realizing that's unfair and wrong. But there is a way out, which is the one you're talking about. We have to have, in one of the, at least the major organizations, the Phoenix Futures of the world, we have to have at least one modality that is the classic modality. this is where we deal with people who may come in with drug problems, but we deal with them as whole person, lifestyle change, identity problems. We have a methodology for teaching it. It's a certain profile, and we can describe it, and it's well researched and so on. So we have that as we think is a primary core. That's my bias. It's a primary core. I didn't tell you to get rid of what else you're doing, but you got to do this. Now, there's another reason, this is the basis of our conversation, there's another reason for having a kind of classical long-term core on your campus, if you want to visualize it that way. It'll become the primary teaching center for all of the treatment that you're doing. So you'll get rid of the whole issue of how can we use some TC in here and there and so on. And I learned all of this by saying, we had a whole labor force that was teaching the drug field for a number of years about how to deal with addicts because they had learned it in long-term treatment. So if you have a core, long-term, classical, what I've called centers of excellence in the campus, we'll talk about how do you launch that, how do you fund that, and so on. So hold those logistical issues aside, but if you put that there, then at least, okay, we're now dealing with a certain population. We even know how to assess that client. We know how to get them into that setting. When we talk about the array of treatment that they think they're seeking, we know what we're doing here. Then we don't disturb what you're doing in those other settings, so you can still make a living doing that. But I can tell you this, the presence of that center of excellence will transform your staff in all of those settings. They will learn, and I've gotten down to the basic element of this, in my view, if I implement the center of excellence, we're going to rotate all new staff for 3 months through the primary long-term TC. They're going to see recovery-oriented treatment going on every day, and they'll begin really learning all of this, and then they can go somewhere else and work. Hopefully in the organization, they'll work somewhere else. So I already jumped to the solution. We can wrap it up and leave now if you want to go. You know,
It's as easy as that.
But that's actually where I am. At least I'm either delusional about this, I'm either geriatric about it, but that's what it is. I came out, I have 10 years of darkness around this because I didn't see a solution. I kept trying to re-challenge the mainstream on this. Do what you're doing. I don't want you to go out of business, and you don't have to worry about it. But if you mean business, then let's come home this way, which is like, if you still want to be a Phoenix Futures of the future, of the real future, we got to have a long-term model in there. And I'm going to tell you this, now this is the hard part, and this is where I earn a living actually. But the hard part is that ideal, high-fidelity, long-term model is not the original model in its form. We've learned a lot about how to essentially make that model better and better. We've learned a lot about not needing corrective, abusive, and challenging issues like that. We've learned a lot how to keep people in treatment. That model has to be implemented right. And the training for that model is the one that, of course, I'm personally interested in. I want to see that happen in a real hands-on way, the real training. And some of the people in the room know what I'm talking about. When I've come out to their programs, I at least try to give them portions of what they really need to understand. And what they need to understand, of course, in that classical model, is they need to understand the theory. Remember, we had no theory in the beginning. But there is a theory now. And we can really talk about it, exactly what we think the disorder is and who the client is and what has to change and why the hierarchical structure has to address issues of like tolerance and criticism and so on. We know how to do this. The use of a whole community to help the individual change a lot of characteristics about themselves. So that's the training little advertisement that I just gave you. But the key is, I think I'm speaking to your issue on this, Rod. And I'm hoping people understand this. I know I'm talking a bit fast, and you'll correct me if that's true, but that is the one solution that I'm excited about.
So you're setting out for us a challenge that is exciting.
Exciting.
It's exciting. It's definitely a challenge. And we'll speak to some of us working in the environments that you're describing. Now, not everybody in the room is working in that environment. In terms of limited funding for people to access our programs. But I know that there is one other person in the room that definitely is in that experience, and he's got his hand up on the front row as well. So, Rune, do you want to...
you're talking about high-fidelity therapeutic communities, and many times I find it difficult to know what that is. Because you can go to therapeutic community, you can have the theory, and you can understand all the elements that are there, you have the proof that it works. But what is going on between the residents and how they conduct themselves and the values of that system is very difficult to see, to detect in many ways. And I believe, if I'm right, that if you talk about high fidelity, you talk about what's going on between the residents while they are doing all the things that they're doing and how they use all the elements of the therapeutic community. Because I've seen the difference between a well-run therapeutic community with low outcome, because it's just a technical part and the real change is not going on. They are just doing what they're doing in the TC. Do you understand what I mean? And the training there is about getting the values into the daily life, not only with the residents, but also what I find difficult for the staff to understand the power of being a member of the therapeutic community and to conduct the values, not only the technical part that we have done this, we have the routines for what we do, and also to understand the therapy in the elements that are there. What is happening with a person, if you have a set time to get up in the morning, and the struggle that person have with that challenge, and how do we work with that, So even though your book is great, George, I have to say that, and all the things are there, we know it's working and we know it's like that, still I find it difficult to understand what a high fidelity therapeutic really is behind these elements. Do you understand my question?
Sort of. I'm also having some auditory, maybe it's me, but there's the content of what you're saying that I'm trying to decipher and see what the real question is there, and I agree with you. Well, let me say this. What does high fidelity mean? You're saying, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Look, the word fidelity means faithful. And so when you talk about faithful, that word is understandable. When we translate it into our discussion, if it's a high fidelity program, it is essentially adhering to the model and the method of the program as we understand it and the theory of the program. So faithful fidelity means we know the theory, we know, and we have a method, and we know the model, which has all of the different activities in there. We know what they should look like. So when I go to programs and I'm talking about fidelity, it's not only that I'm talking about the issues of the particular peers. You first look at the model. Are all of the activities in place? Do they do a seminar? Do they do a morning meeting? Do they have community? Do they have evening business meeting and so on? Do they have encounter groups, as forbidden as that is in these days? Are they really running proper encounter groups in this way? And we can label all of the 8 or 10 fundamental components of the program. That's the model. But then the method, of course, is the community, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but it's essential to the definition of fidelity. If you're talking about community as method, and you proceed from my definition, then the community, when it's a method, when it's operating right as a community, it sets the expectations of the standard, what we'll call the standards of behaviors and attitudes. This is what you should be working toward. The community sets those. That's the expectation element of the community, which should be the powerful transformative element. Not corrections, not punishment, but expectations. So it sets the expectations. The community not only sets it, but it's constantly observing whether you are meeting those expectations. And if you're not meeting those expectations, it's responding to you in an appropriate way. And when you are meeting those expectations, it's responding to you in an appropriate way. The fundamental success of real therapeutic communities, why graduates years later ultimately would see it as a wonderful experience for them, is because it was really learning something that we learn in great families, which is if a family can set expectations and you meet those expectations, you change as a result of that. So the issue was a community as a method sets the expectations, follows whether you're doing them, responds with alternatives, sometimes corrections, responds with a lot of affirmation about how you're doing that and so on. And if in that sense, when a community is doing that, then I'm saying it's high fidelity in terms of its method. It's operating. It's got the program model, that's this fidelity, what I call model fidelity. You got all the pieces in place. Practice fidelity is the community is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So when I go to a program, I automatically look already about how are the peers talking to one another? How are they in their various roles that they play in terms of running the program under staff supervision? How well are they doing that? And then finally, how well are they really delivering things like affirmations? Do they know how to do that? Do they know how to do a thing like do a verbal correction without ripping everybody's lung out, you understand, in terms of what's having some side effect of abuse? All of that is trainable. I found that in our clients, if you can train it, they'll do it. We haven't been training it. They were learning everything by oral traditions and assimilations in the early days. And because we didn't have a theory. You know, shut up and just watch and you'll see what's going on. Well, that's not a very inviting way of training, of moving somebody in. We lost people as a result of that. But you can train that. And it's the other feature now that's the new one in terms of the issue of center of excellence. In that center of excellence, the residents are trained in the theory. And I've essentially now moderated the language so it doesn't sound so academic. We're going to have seminars on why we do what we do. That's the WWW Deleon formula, you know what I mean? That why we do what we do. This is what we do and this is why we do it. Every resident should understand conceptually. They don't have to get it on day one, but they got to understand it conceptually. Why do we do what we do? That immediately forces us to ask that question of ourselves, right? You'll find that there's a lot of deficiencies in staff. They don't know why we do what we do. Well, that's what happened to me when I was in program, you understand? And so they translate it that way. It was essentially their experience, you know, and so therefore that's what governs how they're going to treat the peers. That was essentially one of the negatives of our own development. Today we know how to do that. I first got very excited about this. I found this, there are people in prisons where I was training where they didn't need now experiential effects. What they heard was some of what you're hearing about why we do what we do, and when they heard it intellectually, it made some sense to them, you know, in the sense that they see there's a good reason for that, and that facilitated their engagement, their receptivity, and that's a new feature in any center of excellence. You've got to train the residents in the theory. It's not only the staff, but all the residents.
Thank you, George. Other questions?
So as people will know, because we've been talking about it probably since Prague, the ATCA in Australia has developed TC standards, which are now part of the mainstream, in fact. They've been picked up by two large accreditation organisations in Australia, and so they're rolled out as part of that process for TCs who want to make sure that they are not just meeting health standards, but actually TC standards, which are different. And so they're really important to us. The other thing that's really important to us is training, and I think that one of the things that's happened, because our programs are shortened, we're not getting the graduates coming through as we did once upon a time. So when we look at the way in which our staffing structure is, we're getting more people coming in from the mainstream, more professional people, and that's great. But we also need people with lived experience. So for us, one of the things that's been really important is to roll out that TC training. So we do have a TC training program, which rolls out. So it's 6 intensive days. There's a whole lot of assignments, tasks, and there's placements that have to take place in therapeutic communities as well. So I just wonder if you might mention about this. I think this ties into the Centre of Excellence idea. But I think, now training people who actually understand what the TC method is when they come in, not through the TC, but they're coming in from outside, is incredibly important.
There has been well-developed efforts at, particularly in the credentialing domain, in developing standards. We did it, of course, in the United States in terms of standards for practice. That's all going on, and we recognize that. And that was the purpose, of course, was to generate our own staff, even our recovered staff, to get them to a level where they can be certified and so on. So there were political and financial issues for doing that also. And the standards are unique. NIDA published, a whole monograph on that for participants and staff training, largely based on the Red Book, as a matter of fact, but which essentially modules of training training standards. I'm not opposed to that. I was part of some of that process, of course, to try to at least get standards to be more uniform. I'm hoping that the edge of this discussion that I've been focusing on is that I have discovered it's not enough. Whatever that was doing, hopefully it was doing good things or maybe making things a little bit better, but that's not actually really been our problem. Our problem is if this approach in its unique potency is going to last, if it's going to survive as an approach, it's going to have to, I think, come down to not only do we have standards and so on, that's simply political side of that. It's really this issue of, can we really articulate this approach? Can we essentially provide a training which everybody gets as a result of that understanding a theory, a model, and a method? And ultimately, will the research bear that out to show that people who essentially go into what we call high fidelity programs? It's this issue of getting individuals immersed into the TC approach when they're in a unique program that's practicing it at the highest fidelity. It's not simply sending them some modules or PowerPoints. They learn something from that. What they really need is they've got to really see a powerful program that's operating at high fidelity and go through that process, either as a resident or a staff, at least staff in terms of a partial way, in a design strategy about how they can really see what it means to be, let's say, a staff member in a therapeutic community. That's a very critical, this last point makes the point. Staff, professional staff in particular, they can learn things. They've gone through school, so they can read things and learn things. But what they don't really get, which is the issue that I have always struggled with in terms of training, is their actual role in the therapeutic community approach. What is the role of traditional staff, non-recovered staff? What's their role? And they still think their role is a provider. They think that somehow, somehow they are part of their healers and so on. And of course, it took a long time for me to train some skilled people to see your role. You may have started out in psychiatry and psychology or social work, but your role here is being a member of this community, and that means, if you really wanted to talk about functionally, what that means is that you know and understand community's method thoroughly. That's the academic side of yourself. You got that. But your role is to facilitate that, which means you do less on the side of any direct issues with clients in terms of traditional work. You don't simply take on counseling, and you don't simply take on doing diagnoses and so on. For a member of that community, you're facilitating community as method, because that's the method. And staff people find that very difficult in terms of whether they can see that distinction, because they come in with a training themselves, with an understanding of their view of what they think disorder is and mental health is, and then they want to essentially impose that. And they're not necessarily wrong, they're well-intentioned, they're very smart, but they're not doing anything to advance the community. The issue is their role should be everybody's role, and that is to essentially facilitate community as method. I used to tell counselors, if you simply see that, then you would be, well, even before that, in Bellevue Hospital, when I helped develop a program for seriously mentally ill clients in Bellevue, and that was a 9-month TC model in Bellevue. The nurses and the psychiatrists had to hear what their role change was. And so the nurse who would give out medication, 90% of those people are on medication, when the nurse gave out medication, she had understood community as method. She can immediately detect behavior and attitudinal changes in the client. She was free, like any member, to sometimes deliver a verbal corrective or an affirmation. She was free to talk to other staff people about this individual's behavior, and so on. She understood that it was, yes, her primary function was a nurse, but her role was to be a member of the community. The distinction between roles and functions. And the same thing with the psychiatrist. If we still had a program there where the psychiatrist was the lead authority, it would have gone nowhere. You know what I mean? He was only in the background figure. You understand? If there was a psychiatric emergency, of course we were in the psychiatric hospital. You know what I mean? So he understood, or she understood. Okay, we got to deal with this psychiatric emergency. So there's a lot to teach even in our conversation. So when we talk about standards and we talk about credentialing, that's all necessary to legitimize whatever we're doing. We knew that. But that's not really been the problem we're talking. That's not the one I've been involved with, although I tried to contribute to some solutions on that. It's the one we're talking about hopefully here, which is the issue of understanding fidelity in its fullest sense. And I'm hoping there'll be more consideration for centers of excellence, of the one that we were talking about. I think that's the direction I'm promoting, frankly. So you understand the advertisement on this.
So I've got Keith at the back, and then I've got John at the front. Thanks, Jordan.
These are staggeringly difficult programs to research.
I didn't hear that, Keith.
Staggeringly difficult programs to research.
Oh, they're difficult to research.
Very, very seriously. I mean, they're just hard. If anybody wants to know, I'll talk about all the reasons. But be aware, somebody like George who has stuck with this for 50 years, nobody would have stuck with this for 50 years. And many of the ways that we probably ought to be doing research in TCs have really only come online the last decade. They didn't exist, literally. Two questions. One, if you could say a little bit about the relationship between resident roles and identity change. Number two, is anybody thinking about, when it comes to fidelity, TCs are a bunch of interconnected pieces. TCs are not modular. You can't just take one piece out without affecting other pieces. Is anybody talking about which pieces can you maybe tweak with a little bit and have less effects? And the example I want to use in prison TCs, one of the things that's just blatantly obvious is you have to change the work program, for the most part, because at least in American prisons, they won't let the TCs fix their own food. So there are certain fundamental things that TCs do, that TC residents do, that can't happen in prisons. Is anybody thinking about the effects of that? And I honestly don't know.
Well, your question is a serious question. When we originally, in our enthusiasm to get into new settings and populations like the prison population, we were really striving over our heads. We were actually asking them to make real changes in their culture and in their settings to allow us, in our arrogance, to do what we wanted to do in there. And in the early days, Rod and Naya, for example, were able to somehow work that through that institution, New York, in the New York experience in the New York prisons, when Harry and others were also, and Ronnie Williams were working it in there. We had an advantage in the early days because the prisons then, as one example of the tweaking issue, the prisons in the correctional settings, they were willing at that time to give us a little room. You had to deal with them to do this. But they allowed us to go as far as we can go. There were obvious limitations, but they allowed us to have some movement. So if your question is the difficulties, that is, it's best illustrated in the difficulties in adapting the TC to institutional and other kinds of organizational settings, that's an ongoing struggle, but that I always have called the adaptation of the model for the population and the setting, right? There's a whole book that I edited on community as method and special populations in special settings. And that issue is the fundamental issue, that TCs really had to be mature enough to adapt its approach. And the first set of adaptations were good because those settings are kind of deferred to us. And we were able to, work that. And then, of course, when they themselves saw there were great benefits in that, particularly in the correctional setting, that TCs that were well run in the prisons were also good for the prisons, you understand? Mm-hmm. They found that out. And so we had credibility in. Then the deterioration started later on. So the first quiz, it's not simply a tweak, it is the general issue of adapting the model to populations and settings, other than the traditional community-based TC, which is presumably the freest model. So that's my first comment there. I don't know whether that addressed all of what your concern was.
Hello.
Thanks,
Hi.
Jordan.
Thanks, George. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on why commissioners insist on compromising on fidelity. So if you're thinking about the dose-response correlation that you were describing, and that the evidence shows that at certain months, so at 6 months we can deliver this set of outcomes, but at 18 to 24 months we can deliver a completely different set of outcomes, and you were describing the kind of personal transformational change that can be achieved, the change in identity after 18 to 24 months. I wondered if there was any thinking about why, and it maybe varies from place to place, but is it that commissioners doubt the evidence? Is it the aspirations lacking that maybe all commissioners are looking for? Is that stabilisation, and that maybe the new identity stuff is a bit too aspirational for commissioners? And so is it stigma? Or is it finances, that they can only afford to commission X amount? Or are there some other reasons? Because presumably the answer to the why will need to be addressed in terms of centres of excellence. If we're looking for investment, if we're looking at 18 months programmes, we need to be understanding why there is that resistance or insistence on compromising fidelity. Because presumably it doesn't come from us. We don't turn up saying commissioners for 3 months. We've got a model, we've got evidence that shows the effect that can be delivered over this longer period. So any kind of thoughts around about that and how we overcome that?
Look, you may not like hearing this. I think it's not all their problem. I think it's been part of our problem. We essentially wanted to move into the mainstream. From a historical perspective, variations of the therapeutic community over 2,000 years, they have always emerged, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, but then they disappear. Once they get into the mainstream, they disappear because they get absorbed or co-opted. All great self-help movements have gone that direction because they didn't begin in the mainstream. They didn't begin by mainstream power, which is, the doctors and the government people and the academics. So that's a kind of my first understanding of your question, or the answer to that, is that I see that this is not unique to TCs. If we started on the outside, I didn't go to school, I have no degrees, you know what I mean? I didn't come from where you came from, but I want you to support us. So that one is hard right at the outset. Secondly, unfortunately, some of the warts of the TC, some of the negative behaviors and attitudes in TCs, poorly run programs that we have seen, added to the noise, the dirty noise of that. And the issue and they had reason, that is, the mainstream folks had reason to be suspicious of all of this. Third was a primary economic issue. Anything that's going to come out of the marginal populations, from clients themselves, and don't need professionals, you understand that, in terms of all of their training, they're basically supplanting a whole industrial component, you understand, in that sense, so that there's no attraction if you're going to remove the salaries and the authorities of mainstream people in something that non-professionals can do very well. So, and then finally and this is the hard one I mentioned a little earlier, there was the disorder itself, the client themselves, which they didn't like. They didn't like that disease. It was too threatening, it's too upsetting, and so that was the stigma side of that. Even to the point, as I mentioned earlier, is that even professionals like myself who worked with them were also stigmatized. I don't have a real beef on this, but the issue is that I can hear that colleagues of mine are saying, why are you working in that field? You know what I mean, in terms of what's going to be your future if you work in this field. I hope I proved them wrong, but who knows? So I think there are several theoretical reasons about that. And then there's the fundamental data. We had not made the case in a consistent, programmatic way, from decades of research to decade of research, if we were able to do that, to show ultimately two or three critical, convincing arguments. There is a profile of client that is most suitable for long-term residential treatment. Mm-hmm. We need to specify that profile of client. You're not necessarily going to get them all, but there's that profile. It's a kind of specialty treatment in that sense, that needs 2 years, you understand, in that respect. We see it in and disaffiliated groups who need whole lifestyle changes, where they need something more than, their drug abuse being addressed. They need a lot more. So, and if we can then say, we have the treatment of choice for them, or we have the path, that's the path that they've got to be on, and convince them and show through the research, several projects, you do this, whether it's going to be for Native Americans, whether it's going to be for criminal addicts and so on, those special populations that need what they need, and show that that's the treatment. Nobody else can do this as well as you do it. That's the story we want to tell. And even though we told it here and there in particular programs and projects, we were never able to, our own field was never able to organize that message for some of the reasons that I was just talking about in this session. Not everybody in this room who's worked in TCs realize that we have a theory. They wouldn't even use that word. And if you're going to talk to mainstream people, you should be able to articulate your theory. You don't say, in our program we do wonderful things, you should talk to our graduates and they'll tell you. Mm-hmm. That's not the case you make, you know what I mean? So this is the reason you're hearing me with a lot of kind of geriatric vociferousness, to say there is a story to tell, and it can be told in good academic terms also. And in a sense, if we can tell that story and we do it right, and we gradually drifted off and didn't do it right, so we had a lot of examples that would argue against our own success. So I think that's roughly the story on that, and why they don't like us, you know what I mean, in that respect. But we have done better than that, the way I'm characterizing it now. There are a lot of professionals who have a kind of 2 degrees separation, deep respect for the TC, because they know that there are things that we were doing in there that no one else was doing, and they couldn't do it, and they wouldn't do it. So I'm hoping, does that partially answer your question? Thank you. Yeah. I'm really hoping that the ideas that we're talking about here would capture your imagination. And I want to repeat something, so you'll forgive me for this. As I say, since the years of when I was doing active research, a lot of research, to make the case, I gradually saw that TCs themselves were kind of fumbling and disappearing and surrendering in different ways. And so our case was harder and harder to make, even though we had such an impressive beginning in that respect. And some clever, large organizations keep themselves funded and keep yourself going. I understand that, but that's not the same as really refining a powerful methodology of human change. The use of an entire community in training each other about how to change their lives. Think about that in terms of a social psychological paradigm. You get an entire community that is only focused on helping each other change their lives going forward. And if you can demonstrate that, you can put those communities together. Now what you're talking about is, I can deal with 100 people. I don't have to necessarily rely on a case-by-case, one-by-one, face-to-face. There's a place for all of that. There's a place for all of that, as a matter of fact, in our graduates to say after they leave. We used to say in the early days, you did very well, you're a graduate, now find a therapist and continue to work. And we had a selected group of therapists who understood what went on in the TCs, so they were able to be part of the continuity, integrated contiguity. I kind of resuscitated this in Royce. If I were going to develop a Royce system, an integrated system, every one of those providers, after clients leave TCs, are going to be trained in the TC. So the provider will understand exactly what happened in there, and these clients will find that they can deal with a therapist who has a good understanding of what their history has been. So there's a real story to tell about recovery-oriented integrated systems. I'm sorry to interject that in this point, but it's a kind of an inspirational point for me. But does that help?
Unfortunately, it's time to bring this session to a close. So I'm hoping that for those of you that do have some questions, you can put them to George and to Karen during the break. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to George and for Karen for such a very interesting debate and thought-provoking questions and discussions. And as I say, I hope that they'll continue within the break.
Thank you very much. Sorry.